Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Nemesis. Your airplane is pulling out its stops. Your airplane is growling with its props, pawing the tarmac with its landing gear, streaming exhaust. That one sortie is here that you've been fearfully anticipating. 12 o'clock high, the Red Baron is waiting in a holding pattern behind the sun. His mind is focused as his Gatling gun, inviting you there up to the skies. You, his one absent precious prize. He wants to silence your persiflage, to put your picture on his fuselage. He wants his mind relieved of you. He wants his gun to talk to you, embracing the murderous dialogue. He doesn't care that you're just a dog. So that's about Snoopy, if you remember.
That's a great ode to Snoopy. He doesn't care, you're just a dog. You are the Red Baron, Snoopy.
Right.
Yeah.
Author and translator Arshia Sattar and Pulitzer Prize winning poet, essayist and critic Vijay Sheshadri talk about writing, editing, making anthologies, and what it means now to be a poet from India in a globalized world. This episode was originally a BIC venue event that took place in the BIC premises on the 25th of June, 2022. Arshia kindly filled in for poet Jeet Tayal, who was the intended interlocutor for the day. And now, over to Arshia.
So, Vijay Sheshadri, Pulitzer Prize winning poet, born in Bangalore. Welcome home, one might say.
Thank you.
Do you have any kind of relationship with Bangalore? I mean, it's your native, literally, because it is your nativity.
I have family here, and I'm running a marathon, visiting all of the family. And not only all of the family, but the representatives of those people who have died, I have to visit them too. And then, and I have to make sure I don't tell anyone that I'm visiting anyone else twice, because then I would have to visit everyone twice. And, the ambassadorial negotiations are just intricate and complicated and fascinating. And what's interesting is that this is a large extended family. I'm sure you're aware of the dynamics, the peculiarly Indian dynamics, and it has had a death. My mother's favorite brother died in May here, and I'd really wanted to see him. I mean, he was an interesting, problematic figure. When he was 19, he ran away to Bombay to become a film star, and no, he failed dramatically. He felt he had the good looks, and he did. He was a handsome man, and but he had no skill at all. They didn't know what to do with him. So he came back here with his tail between his legs and became a mechanical engineer. And he died, and that unsettled the whole family. So I've been regaled with all of the stories again, everywhere I've gone, about him, about the conflicts, about the difficulty. And so, yeah, I'm very invested in this place in an interesting sort of way. And you were saying, when we were talking before, Arshia brought up the word myth and mythic. And, and myth and memory are interestingly connected to each other. And there is this really sort of mythological quality to the stories I was given when I was in America. My mother talked obsessively about her family, and she really mythologized. And So I always have a sense of it, the stories as being epic, you know. And interestingly, I had dinner with a young cousin in New York who is the son of the uncle who died recently. And he immediately, and he's been in America for a while, he got a PhD in physics at MIT, and then he went to Silicon Valley, you know, one of those classic Indian diaspora trajectories. And he said, Vijay, they call me Vijay, they don't call me Vijay. And he said, it's like the Mahabharata. Sort of, yeah. Yeah.
I have to say, I was waiting for the magic word, Ramayana, Mahabharata. Yeah, I say myth at the drop of a hat. So, but I'm glad it sparked a whole sort of.
It's more like the Mahabharata. For me, the Mahabharata is a much more cynical poem than the Ramayana, you know, and much more tragic and Shakespearean, if you would like to call it that.
And of course, my work is in Ramayana, so I will argue with you another time about which is more tragic. But certainly, the Mahabharata is way more Shakespearean. So, since you mentioned Shakespeare, I was going to bring it up later, but why not now? You, in an interview somewhere, you said that for you, the idea of words and the idea of poetry actually came to you from Julius Caesar, from actually listening or watching the movie, right, with Marlon Brando in it.
No,
Sorry.
I mean, I think, you know, in that interview, people always ask you in interviews, you know, how did you become a poet? Which is such a bedeviling question, you know, it's sort of.
How did you become a poet, Vijay?
Well, you know, I mean, the first time I think I must have been 12, 13 years old. We read Julius Caesar, and there was something about the sound of that, you know, this was the noblest Roman of them all speech that Antony speaks over the body of Brutus, that struck me as incredibly moving and interesting and compelling. And, you know, I just heard it. And it kind of rolls to that simple statement, this was a man. But the way in which the music is arranged is such that there's a remarkable harmony of musical effects and rhetorical effects that makes it possible for Antony saying this was a man to have this incredible resonance. And I was like practically in tears when I first read that. And the nearest, you know, everyone is looking for an origin myth. There are no origin myths, right? You know, there really aren't, you know. It's all retrospective. And it's all ultimately political, all of this stuff, right? Which is why the Aeneid is probably the model of epics, because it has a really clearly political agenda that we can see to this day. He's glorifying the Augustan age for, you know, for his patron.
Another point where I could argue with you.
Right, yeah. No, I just throw this stuff out.
Yeah.
You know. We poets can say outrageous things and get away with it. No one, you know, expects us to be rigorous or, you know, even thoughtful. Because for us, for poets, the sound of something is much more important than the sense of something. We don't have to be rigorous about that. We have to be persuasive, which is a little different than being rigorous.
Yes. Yeah. But I'm going to throw another interview at you. Because your parents were part of a very early migration to the US, there was a sense of isolation as an Indian family. And that led you to a certain solitariness, perhaps, or an interiority. And that's where the poetry rose from or came from.
Yeah. I was always a reader. There was a sort of double whammy. I'd been skipped a couple of grades when I got to Canada, so I was 2 years younger than all of my cohort. It was interesting. I always try to puzzle it out and figure it out, and I can't quite get it. Ram Guha is here, and I was talking to him yesterday. I was talking about this very interesting problem, which I think all of us have, and which Naipaul identifies in Gandhi. Naipaul has written about Gandhi a lot in his career, or he wrote about Gandhi a lot in his career, and he says in this late piece about Gandhi that the problem Gandhi was always confronting was the problem of how to fit one civilization into another. And that was a political problem, it was a psychological problem. It had something profound to do with the way India was going to modernize, and everybody has a set of solutions of, the nature of Indian modernity and the trajectory of Indian modernity. And that sort of struck me, really looking back, as the big problem of my experience. I mean, I was at this international conference at Shimla. That's why I'm here, because I was invited there by the Sahitya Academy. And I thought, wow, I'll get to talk about this. I didn't get to talk about it at all. They gave me a small amount of time with a bunch of other people, and everybody else read their poems, so I had to read a poem. I thought we were going to have this great discussion about what it means to be dispersed in the world and have to gather yourself together again, and then piece together different elements, right, from sort of panorama of experience, a lot of which is Indic, a lot of which isn't. And so you created a sort of cubistic version of the self, and that was sort of the thing out of which I think I became a poet, just having to fit two cultures into another, two civilizations into another, before I knew I was doing that, that's just the condition you find yourself in if you are sort of exiled from your society and put in another society. Whether, even if you're a little kid, you're doing that.
No, that's quite lovely, actually, that it's the disjunction, it's the dissonance
Sure.
that actually creates the music
Sure.
of
Exactly.
poetry. Yeah.
There's a wonderful metaphor that I always use about, in crystallography, new crystals grow where there are flaws in the old crystals, right? That's how a crystal grows and develops. A.K.
Ramanujan used to tell us that's how the epic grows, like a crystal, wherever
I think
there
that's
is
where
a
I must have gotten that from, actually.
Probably.
I've been using it as if it were my own for a long, long time. But now that you mention it, I remember his saying it at a seminar he was at Columbia.
That's right. He would say it. He wouldn't write it. Because it's.
He was a brilliant guy.
Oh my God! Yeah. He was my teacher. Yeah. So the thing about Raman was that he knew what to say and what to write. So when he spoke, he always spoke as a poet. But when he wrote as a scholar.
Yeah.
And to say that something grows like a crystal is poetic. Not theoretical at all. So. Yeah. Okay, so a Pulitzer Prize.
Uh-huh.
That's a big one. It's very American. I mean, it's sort of, as an American poet, is there anything bigger, really? And what does it mean to you, a Pulitzer?
I feel I deserve another Pulitzer. And this last book, I thought it was my best book, and I thought they should give me another one. Because when I got the first one, I was the primary caregiver for my parents, who were very old, and my mother was very sick at that time, and they lived outside of Pittsburgh, and I lived in New York, and I was always traveling back. And so I felt like I didn't really get to enjoy it, so...
But you're allowed to get another Pulitzer.
Yeah, you are allowed to get
It's not like the Nobel or something.
Right, yeah. But, I want to get another one when I'm young enough to enjoy it.
Yeah.
Not when I'm...
Well, there's also the MacArthur. That's pretty sweet. Yeah. I mean, if you do Pulitzer and MacArthur...
I'm waiting for that one.
Yeah.
That would be great if they gave me a MacArthur. could retire.
Yeah.
That would be
Well, I
fantastic.
wish you the MacArthur. But I also want to talk to you about being a teacher
Yeah.
and wondering, as with all practitioners or makers of art, the dissections that teaching involves, the analysis that teaching involves, and the more romantic notion we have of how art is created, that it's not analytic, it's synthetic,
Sure.
it brings things together and all. How does your writing practice and your teaching of writing, do they coincide? Do they diverge?
Yeah. Well, there are two things about teaching. Like, a lot of writers resent teaching, because they feel that the world should just acknowledge them for their writing and their writing alone, and I don't feel that way, probably because I'm a poet and I'm never going to sell, even if you're a famous poet, you really don't sell enough to support yourself. I kind of am grateful that I'm allowed to teach and have a middle-class income and live the life that I do. I also really like teaching. I'm not necessarily a people person, so, the kids are okay, but the thing about young people is that there's such a corrupting force, right? Their innocence is so corrupting, that they don't know these things, and they believe they have these ludicrous beliefs about, the world, and you just kind of, there's something just spiritually enervating about that. But if you can just sort of keep them as students instead of letting them spill over onto you the way they want to, and
Such good advice. If there's anybody here who's teaching or planning to teach, write this down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Learn it by heart.
So then you can engage in a sort of a discourse that's almost theatrical with that. And that's a lot of fun. And they are cute, right?
Yeah, they're
there's
quite
something cute
seductive,
about
they're
these young-
alluring. Yeah.
So you kind of feel like you're at least getting that small pleasure out of them, like looking at a kitten or a puppy, and then knowing it's going to mess up on the floor and you're going to have to clean it up somehow, but that's the price you have to pay. But so that aspect of teaching, I sort of, I'm ambivalent about, but the intellectual side of it, that you have to kind of make the complicated things you understand simple and clear enough so that you can communicate those things about whatever field you're involved in. That allows you to sort of constantly return to the underlying conceptual structures of what you do. And that, I think, is very useful for me. Just to get back to the essentials and communicate them, and thereby understand them again and refresh your understanding of them.
Yeah. I find every time I have a book in my head, I really want to teach, because it's exactly what you're saying.
Sure.
You work it out over and over and over again, and
Sure.
you hear it come back at you. And do you think that's true also maybe for criticism? That if we were regular critics, yourself, for example, would you experience that same sense of renewal and clarity because you were, in fact, simplifying things for other people? Or is it specifically to do with the mess that young people can make?
Yeah. I think it has more to do for me with the mess. I do write criticism and essays. I find that somehow competes with the activity of writing poetry, that I can't really do the one and the other at the same time. Certain writers could, Auden famously could, turn from writing an essay or writing a preface or to writing a poem, and very, very naturally and easily. I don't have that kind of fluency. Writing is difficult for me. It's painful, it's bloody, it's, a mess. It's not a pleasant experience. And I'm a disgusting person when I write, especially when I write poems, I don't bathe.
You are just
You know?
presenting yourself as the archetypal poet.
I know.
You know, oh, it hurts me so much. It's about blood, it's about sweat, it's about tears. I don't
just
bathe.
awful.
Very good, very good. We're getting exactly the picture we came to receive.
Yeah.
But Jeet was your student at Sarah
Jeet
Lawrence,
was, yeah.
and he was the one when I mentioned that I wanted to talk to you about nonfiction, because you teach courses in nonfiction, right? And obviously, not being a poet myself, I said, nonfiction. What is he teaching? Essay writing. But then I went to your course descriptions, and I realized, rightly for the poetic imagination, most writing is nonfiction.
Wow.
And you teach it through essays, through diaries, through poetry, other poetry.
Yeah.
So how do you teach? What is it that you teach? And how do you teach it?
Yeah. First, I want to say before I answer that question, you must be a splendid intellectual in this intellectual environment. Arshia has informed herself about me in the space of 24 hours in such a way that, dazzles me. I mean, my God,
You're just flattered, my
No,
dear.
it's true. It's amazing, You went to my course descriptions, when I get interviewed, nobody takes that kind of pain, and yeah. I mean, I teach nonfiction. I started the nonfiction writing program at Sarah Lawrence. And they let me do that. I had written essays, and the people there wanted to give me a full-time job, but the writers there only had half-time jobs. So they said, because I had been teaching as a guest, and they said, well, we can make you full-time if you become the director of a new nonfiction program. And the reason they let me do that was not because I was known as a nonfiction writer, but because I'd been an editor at The New Yorker. And I put it to them, and they agreed that from a pedagogical point of view, it's probably better to be an editor than to be, a writer if you're teaching other people how to write prose. And that's proved to be the case. And increasingly, I started just teaching nonfiction because I had a program that was staffed mostly by guest writers. They didn't give me tenure lines. And so I had to constantly scramble to fill classes because the popularity of our classes was constantly growing, because it was sort of a great age of memoir at that time. In America, people were turning away to a certain extent, not entirely, from fiction and writing memoir. And I started, a journalism program there, and I started an oral history program. Oral history fascinates me as a genre, I think it's really quite wonderful. And I started a radio writing program. So we had a lot of different classes, and I always had to fill in. So now I exclusively teach nonfiction writing. I teach seminars in rhetoric. If I teach outside of that, I will usually teach lecture courses in things like Shakespeare for writers or the Bible for writers and stuff like that. So I don't teach poetry. I mean, I think I agree with Aristotle that at a certain point you can't teach poetry. Either people can make metaphors or they can't. It's just, it's a genetic trait that they either have or they don't.
No, I would agree. How funny that you use Shakespeare for writers, and I teach epic for writers. How do you tell a story? How do you tell a complicated story? How do you make things resonate, cohere, speak to each other, and all that? So now I think we should really, really talk about your poems. Would you like to read Nemesis? I know you've been avoiding that a little bit. And I want you to talk also about what rhyming means to you. Yeah? And your the throwaway that there's Kanye and there's Lamar.
I mean, I always use hip hop just to justify rhyming, because rhyming is always challenged in American poetry, and I say, well, rhyme is so much a part of the language arts. I mean, in America, there was a long period of anti-formalism, which I think diminished the poetry. And then there was a reactionary response to that, but I never felt like the reactionary response was one I was a part of. And this happened in the 1980s because that really had a political quality to it. And I never sort of embraced that sort of politics. And I used to say to people, well, Brecht rhymed. All of the poems Brecht wrote. Brecht wrote sonnets, you know. Rhyme is not at all inconsistent with a radical politics. And so I tried to disassociate myself, you know. But I liked it, and it takes a lot of skill, and I like, you know, things that require skill. And I think, you know, the problem with poetry in America, I've always felt, is that it just isn't rhetorically and linguistically skilled enough in the way that it used to be. And that great generation of American poets from, you know, the post-war generation, when America was the richest country the world were known by so many, you know, orders of magnitude, and had a sort of hegemonic power over the world, you know, a consequence of that was the expansion of American consciousness to a great degree. And that produced a great generation of poets. And all of those poets were very, very well versed in traditional forms, even though they rejected them, you know. But even in the rejection, there was a tremendous underlying, you know, genetic richness to what they did. And I knew those poets. I mean, you know, the thing about my relationship to poetry, and I think, you know, this is a place I can say this, the town of my birth in India, it was a means by which I became American. I was like the character in the Mahabharata who was in the forest watching the archery lesson, right? I mean, that great, great incident, you know, with its tragic conclusion. You know, America is a gentle place. They didn't ask me to cut off my own thumb.
You're going to get a MacArthur. Nobody's taking your thumb yet. So
right.
yeah,
Nobody's taking my thumb. But that was the way in which, you know, I watched this art. And my parents expected me to become a doctor or a scientist or a mathematician. But instead, I was watching these poets and, you know, and so I learned all about them, right? I mean, I studied them, I thought about them, I constantly deepened my understanding of the English tradition and the American tradition, and I worked out all of the controversies in my own mind, recapitulated them, and so I acquired a lot of formal knowledge that my generation of American poets doesn't have. I acquired a lot of rhetorical knowledge that they don't have. And so I think an accusation that can be leveled against me, and probably has been in America, is that I tend to be perceived as somewhat elitist as a poet.
Because you're so well read.
Yeah, because, you know, I mean, to be well read is somehow construed as not speaking directly from the heart, which is bullshit, right? I mean, that's just such bullshit. I mean, it's that dreadful American anti-intellectualism, which is such a problem for the country. Oh, it's such a bore, yeah. But anyway, I mean, I'll read Nemesis and...
Well, tell us who the poets were that you were reading, this generation, just before yours, the post-war generation.
Well, I started out when I was 16 reading Galway Connell, who's an American poet who was kind of born, I think, in 1926. And it was very, very important then, and the other thing that got me into poetry was, of course, the Vietnam War. The protest against that war, and I was precocious politically. When I was 14, I was sort of marching in the November moratorium in Pittsburgh in 1969 against the war. And it was the huge cataclysmic event of my history as an American. And it really transformed me, made me into very much a countercultural figure after I graduated from college. I hitchhiked out to California. I mean, my parents were they didn't know what to do with me because I'd become a
Then
hippie.
you grew up
know?
to be a poet. Your poor parents.
I know, my poor
Really?
parents, But, I won them a Pulitzer Prize.
This is true. This is true. And they were
Until
both alive to enjoy
Until
it.
that, they were going, And I did give them a grandson, which my son has yet to do for me.
Well, see.
Or a granddaughter, I'm not,
Well, thank you for including that.
A grandchild, whatever gender the kid wants to be is fine with me,
Yeah, that's
as long as
another
it's
discussion.
a kid. Yeah. I mean,
Anyway, so you became a counterculture figure because you hitchhiked to California and
Right.
the Vietnam War really marked you, I
Right.
think, perhaps, and made you
Right.
an American in ways that perhaps...
Sure.
Yeah.
The thing about poetry, and the reason I read Galway Canal is that he wrote a book called The Book of Nightmares, which was a direct response to the Vietnam War. And I think I read that when I was 17. And so there was a mixing and an intermingling between my impulse to rebel and protest and the art of poetry, because that was a real intersection, and poetry was really, really powerful in the campuses, and it started very early. Started in 1963 with Robert Bly and David Ray, and they started an organization called Writers Against the War in Vietnam. This was when Vietnam was just getting going, but they saw what was happening, because all of this kind of ideological and intellectual turmoil had been very much a part of the 50s, which seemed on the surface to be Eisenhowerian and placid, but wasn't placid at all. And it erupted, around the time of the Kennedy assassination and the escalation in Vietnam. And they were very much on top of that, and they gave teach-ins and readings at college campuses. And those teach-ins and readings became the seed of what eventually became a mass movement, And it was the people of America who ended the Vietnam War. It really was. And those poets were ones I read, and poetry itself seemed to have a certain valor for me, just in relationship to the turmoil that was going on, a way to sort of organize one's inner understanding of this tremendous political upheaval and turmoil.
Yeah, in a strange way, poetry was really mainstream in those years. When you think that Dylan is actually, Bob Dylan is a
Right.
poet, and this culmination in Woodstock of the teach-in, the sit-in, all of that, it really occupied center stage.
Sure.
Poetry is protest, poetry is revolution,
Sure.
and yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, what a
And
time.
poetry is feminism. I mean,
Very much so, yeah.
very much a kind of central to second wave feminism. I mean, not so much anymore, but then. And so it was a very exciting art for a 16, 17-year-old when I really got into contemporary American poetry. And so those were the political people I read, but then I moved on. Like that character in the forest, I was looking at everything, right? I was reading it all, I was thinking about it all, there was a period when I was deeply into French surrealism and then Spanish surrealism. And John Ashbery, who's the great sort of abstract poet of our era. And I was also reading people like Yeats. I love Yeats. I'm very influenced by Yeats.
So Nemesis.
Okay, Nemesis, okay. And this is in heroic couplets. It's right out of Pope. Nemesis. Your airplane is pulling out its stops. Your airplane is growling with its props, pawing the tarmac with its landing gear, streaming exhaust. That one sortie is here that you've been fearfully anticipating. 12 o'clock high, the Red Baron is waiting in a holding pattern behind the sun. His mind is focused as his Gatling gun, inviting you there up to the skies. You his one absent precious prize. He wants to silence your persiflage, to put your picture on his fuselage. He wants his mind relieved of you. He wants his gun to talk to you, embracing the murderous dialogue. He doesn't care that you're just a dog. So that's about Snoopy, if you remember.
That's a great ode to Snoopy. He doesn't care, you're just a dog. You are the Red Baron, Snoopy.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this book is suffused with death, right? And the Red Baron behind the sun is, and when my parents died, I became conscious of death. Before that, I didn't know it existed. I had no idea. I'd heard about it. I'd even known people who checked out, not many.
Happens to other people.
Yeah. It's like, wow. Yeah. So
the book is called, this is a new book, and it's called That Was Now, This Is Then. But
nice
even
cover,
if we can't get the book here yet, this and other many wonderful poems are in this book, which you can do it with, if you ain't reading. So, but it's an absolutely marvelous anthology, which
we should say something about it, because Jeet insisted that we shill for him, and I was kind of like...
I was told that this whole session was supposed to be around the anthology.
Right.
So here we are. It is called, unsurprisingly, The Penguin Book of Indian Poets. It's 900 and something pages. It's not the first anthology Jeet has done, but this is, look at it. It's going to be definitive if it isn't already.
It's just amazing.
It is.
I mean, that he put it all together, it's kind of... I mean, Jeet is really amazing.
He is. And, every time he does anthologies with, metronomic regularity. And what impresses me always, how generous he is.
Yeah.
And how widely he reads Indian poets and creates a community. And good. So that brings me actually to something we exchanged very briefly in our very brief emails. And you said that this anthology, Jeet's anthology, creates a diversity, right? And is it, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
It's sort of, I say this in the most admiring and loving and generous way possible. The anthology itself seems like a huge folly, like an architectural folly, right? That, like, you've taken this remarkably dispersed, various, extraordinary poetic output in English by people of Indian origin over the course of the 75 years of the Indian Republic, and tried to contain it in a structure, in a sort of textual structure. And reading it is somehow as rich and bewildering as India itself, So in some sense, whether he wants to or not, he's recapitulating a kind of mind-boggling diversity. I mean, you can't really hold India in your mind. I mean, who can? I mean, it's just sort of... And then Indianness, wherever it exists, seems to be so extraordinarily various and complex. And
he's really sort of... I love this image of the architectural folly. But what's holding it together are two artifices, actually. One is that we became Indian in 1947. Right? And the other is that we're Indian at all. I mean, look at yourself, for example. You have won every possible poetic accolade in America, as you should. And yet now, this Indianness, you're actually flirting with a certain Indianness, which does not seem to have occupied your early work.
Well, I have a story about that.
Tell.
This whole Indianness thing is, again, it's something that we're all dealing with, because we're all dealing with the problem of fitting one civilization into another. When I published my first book in the 90s, it was around the time of the 50th anniversary of the Republic. And there was a lot of kind of interest in India. The New Yorker did an India issue. I remember I was a part of editing it. Right, yeah. Right around then, Shashi Tharoor was at the UN. I think he was the assistant to the Secretary General. I can't remember. He had a very big job. And I think he came up was a candidate, one of 3 candidates for the Secretary General job, which he didn't get, so he came back here. And he and I knew him a little bit just in terms of like, I was in touch with, through friends of mine, Mina Alexander and David Lelyveld, the Indian writers scene. I knew Amitav Ghosh, who lived in Brooklyn near me and stuff like that. So I knew that community of kind of expatriate Indians, and so I knew him a little, and he and I were invited to read together by a group called the Network of Young Indian Professionals. And these were highly successful young people in their 20s and 30s who had professional jobs in finance, in IT. They were sort of already a well-formed community, and an interesting immigrant community, because they had this organization where they would get together and kind of create a new identity, a new solidarity, which was based on India. Even though they came from various other different communities in India, they were kind of creating an Indianness that couldn't have existed in India. I think the socialist idea was always to create that Indian identity, which was trans community and stuff like that, rather than what's happened now, which is pretty deplorable as far as I'm concerned. And that was happening with them. And they were also a classic immigrant group, an immigrant organization. The network of young Indian professionals was basically a pickup scene, right? They would basically be, getting together to party and to hook up and stuff like that. But they felt they had to have the patina of something serious, something, valorous in some way. So they would have these cultural events before they went off and partied together. And so they would have readings, and they invited Sashi and me to read, and we both read, and then there was a Q&A. And that was very Indic because they needed to have discourse. It wasn't enough just to hear us. They needed us to pronounce as wise men on the issues of the day and stuff. And poets will talk and talk and talk, but they always think about that as with a certain amount of skepticism. But anyway, this young woman got up in the Q&A, and she was very challenging to me. And she said to me, in a tone of anger and exasperation, "There's nothing Indian in your work." And I was going, oh my God, And this was the beginning of identity politics, right? And this was obviously an identity group that was affirming their Indianness somehow and was constructing their Indianness, right? So they needed people who would help them construct their Indianness, and we as writers were in the business supposedly of doing that. We had to sing for our supper, so to speak. And that was the way we were singing for our supper. And I was saying, oh, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond to this? And I came up with something absolutely brilliant. I said, India functions in my work the way Flaubert says God functions in the universe.
That is amazing.
He is everywhere present, but nowhere apparent.
No, you deserve a MacArthur, a Nobel, another Pulitzer, just for pulling that line out under pressure. Well done.
I know, it was fantastic. I patted myself. And she, I think she just sat down quietly after that.
I would have, yeah. Oh, that's so funny, this story. And about the fact that it's actually a pickup place, because the graduate student equivalent of it, which I went to, the India Association, where Diwali party meant samosa, and then pickup, right? That's it. And I'd forgotten about those completely.
Oh my God, yeah.
So,
But yeah, there was a point to that, but I can't remember what it is now.
no, the point
I got
was
lost
that
in the story.
you announced your intention, or you announced the secret of your writing in the late 90s, that India is always in your work and all like that, but you
Right.
didn't actually get to writing about India. Or what I was saying earlier was flirting
Yeah.
with this idea of Indianness, right? Because Indianness obviously is a construct, not simply for those young people in the US in the 90s, but it's a construct that is very, very much contested
Right.
and under threat and siege today.
Yeah.
But it's about Jeet creating the artifices of an anthology through Indianness and through, the birth of the Republic. So your position as a so-called Indian, and I know that, I'm really interested to talk to you about this, because you locate the idea of identity, not in a geography, right, but in an existentialism, the self, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you have an Indian self? Do you have an American self?
Yeah, I mean,
Self at all?
the phenomenological attitude as opposed to the anthropological one, right, about the self. The anthropological attitude is that somehow the self is created out of culture, right? That it's formed culturally in some way, so it's connected. The phenomenological attitude is that the self is some sort of transcendental entity that constitutes the world. It might constitute the culture it finds itself in, but there is something about it that transcends and somehow pre-exists the anthropological particulars that it encounters, right? I was trained in philosophy, and it's much more congenial for me to think about the generation of the self in that way. So there is something accidental about, for me, what people call identity, and the call to an allegiance to identity, And I think that's not abstruse or abstract, but very concrete and very exigent. It's the failure to understand that has led to the political turmoil of identity politics and jingoism and nationalism and all of those things that are really very, very dangerous here. They're very dangerous in America. They're a real problem for democracies. And no one ever, for me, properly theorizes, even though a lot of people have this instinct that in some sense, the communities we come from are sort of accidental, that there's something that's transcendent that we have in common. And you can go deeply into this. You can sort of, Jürgen Habermas is sort of a very important political thinker for me. And that idea of discursive democracy, that idea of the self as being kind of created in discourse, in conversation, in community, in colloquia, in some way, and that being essential to democratic functioning.
Blasphemy, anathema, sedition, you're hitting all the boxes tonight. Yeah, but I'm so glad to hear you say all this, really, because these are the things that we need to ask ourselves,
Sure.
when we are so invested in a single identity for ourselves, that I am X and not Y.
Sure.
And you better tell me who you are, because otherwise I don't know how to deal with
Exactly,
you.
yeah.
Those kinds of, they're not even microaggressions. They're real full-on aggressions that actually endanger people's lives.
Sure.
So the idea that the self is created in discourse, right? And it's an active process, not a given, not a passivity. Yeah.
Yeah, and our collective self and our individual self, it's a mystery what the relationship between those is. The mediation is, of course, language. And that's sort of... So, India is always fascinating in that regard, because there's so many ways in which you can think about what goes on politically in relationship to these deep questions about what we are actually.
And the shifting self, the self that is transformable and transformative, and But the centerpiece of this book, That was now, this is then, is the elegy to your father,
Right.
whom you lost recently. And when we were talking upstairs, I mentioned that I wanted you to read from it because it's terribly, terribly moving. But it's also, in the light of the way the session is going, it's also a contrast to Nemesis. And it also actually anchors this discussion that we're having about the self, because as we were saying, that when you lose a parent in your midlife, in the life that, 50s, 60s, and how it, as you said, I didn't know anybody died till my parents died, because it transforms us. We look at ourselves and say, oh my God, I see my mother's arm, or, I see my father's fingers, or something like that. And we become that person. And so it is about our mortality. And so the death of the parent, the dislocation of self, that the death of a parent allows or generates, as it were. So do you want to read from Collins Ferry, and then we will ask other people to join the conversation, and then we'll wrap up? Yeah.
Because, I want to read the central prose section. I want to say something about my father when... because of my mother, not because of my father was somewhere on the autism spectrum and, had no social skills to speak of at all. Very shy man, very quiet. He was a scientist, and he had, in an earlier piece I wrote about his obsession with the Civil War in my book, The Long Meadow, I quote him as saying, "If I hadn't found science, I would have been nothing." So he's one of those early Indian scientists. And he went to America. He wanted to get out. He was, he had strong left-wing sympathies. My mother used to say to me very quietly, "He used to give money to the party." But he went to, I can't really get into his biography, but I will say this one thing. After he died, I arranged the memorial service for him. And we had a lot of people come because they had been in that community for a long time. Americans and Indians. I started the service. I said, well, my father was, I got up with my introductory remarks, and I said, my father was many things, but he was also very much an Indian and a product of the effort to found and the foundation of the Indian Republic. So we're going to start this ceremony by playing the Indian national anthem. And everybody stood up. All the Indians stood up. And the Americans were sitting there saying, oh, they're going to play the Indian national anthem. But the Indians all stood up. So the Americans all stood up. And I played that anthem because, that's the way I saw him, as kind of very much a part of this history. I saw him anthropologically.
Yeah, that is such a sweet story. And absolutely, certainly our parents' generations were part of the dream, the nation building, the republic that has now failed us. But
And, it's a wonderful, I don't know, is it popular here? Do people, the Star-Spangled Banner is so military, But the Indian national anthem is so kind of poetic and peaceful. And I played that version where all of these different Indian artists sing, right? And I found it on YouTube. YouTube is wonderful in that way. But anyway, I wrote an elegy to him. This poem has a story. I'd written, when my mother died, or just before she died, I wrote a very good poem for her, a very strong poem. And when my father died, I sort of, my father died first and my mother died afterward. And, I wrote that poem for my mother when she was dying. And I thought, well, I should write a poem for my father too, just, just because it seemed like the thing to do. And that poem was not a very good poem. But I didn't want to, I was sick of death. I didn't want to think about it too much. And when I was finishing the book, I went to an artist colony, Yaddo, in upstate New York. And Yaddo is built It was a mansion donated by some very wealthy people who had had a lot of tragedy in their lives. Their young children had died. And the grounds and the mansion are said to be haunted. And it's kind of a legend of Yaddo that there are ghosts there. And, ghosts are something you can easily believe in if you open up a certain place in your consciousness. And when I was there for about a week, I kept having really vivid dreams about my father. And they kept coming back every night. I mean, they weren't terrifying or stuff, but they were insistent. And I would see him, and I finally figured it out. I realized, well, he was visiting me because I'd written a really great poem for my mother. And, a somewhat mediocre poem for him, And he was angry, he was upset, So I took that poem and I made it into something much larger, and it became the centerpiece of the book. And I'll read this middle section. It will take a little while because it's fairly long, and it's in prose. I mean, I do write a lot of prose, and it's kind of, all three sections of the poem are addressed to him. I'm speaking to him in the poem, but this one sort of captures in some way the anthropological aspect, the Indic aspect. So I'll start. I have a friend, you'll be glad to know. She and I work together. You'll be glad to know I still have a job. She's an ally, she's sympathetic, she's warm-hearted. She's socially conscious, gentle, a decent type, and from what I've observed, an excellent mother, too. Not very smart, though. A little while after your soundless departure, I was telling her about you. I was describing what I saw as your place. Yes, your highly functional place. On the spectrum of, what are the right words? Neurocognitive homelessness? I was describing cultures of shame evolving across millennia, economies of scarcity versus economies of surplus, civilizations teetering on the edge of time, about to take the plunge into oblivion. Deep India, I said to her. Wonders and terrors, I said to her. Deep India, strewn with elephants and cobras, scorched by temples, mosques, stupas, churches, synagogues, cratered with poverty, hunger and thirst, storms of affliction, shot through with sacred rivers. They flood, they shrivel out. The sun's furious particle stream immerses the pencil-thin scavengers picking sustenance from the dry riverbeds. The infant God opens his mouth to display the entire appalling universe. I told her that long ago, when the earth was still flat, you made your pinched, solitary tramp freighter journey from there to here, Colombo, Suez, across the Middle Sea, then over the far edge. I was talking privation. I was talking history. I was talking injustice. I was getting wound up and indignant. That was what must have triggered her inimitable gift for the sentimental non sequitur. She put her right hand on my left arm and said, "He'll always be with you, in your heart." See what I mean? See what I mean? Not if she had said one bright morning we'd meet up again in heaven. And I wouldn't put it past her to say something like that, too. Would she have made me angrier? I could have kicked her shin. But, wait, don't interrupt. And no, of course I didn't kick her shin. I'd like to explain why I kept talking to her in the aftermath of her idiotic outburst. Why I didn't shake the dust of my feet off at her and cut her off then and there forever. Though the time in which I'm writing this overlaps yours, you'd be amazed and embarrassed if you understood the extent to which we're allowed these days, encouraged even, to indulge feelings and succumb to motives and express resentments and make demands offensive to reason, that a mind with an experience like yours, a burden of discipline, a resignation, and a silence like yours, a mind like yours cowled by melancholy, would consider disreputable, even shocking. I'm sad to say that you won't be surprised that I've taken advantage of this license. I've indulged openly and shamelessly, and also secretly, more times than I'm willing to remember. But I want you to understand that at this moment my talking was anything but self-indulgent. I was confused in the weeks after you died, and my confusion didn't derive from the universal fact that a parent's death is too strangely shaped for a child of theirs to grasp with any confidence, but from the fact that I myself was becoming strangely shaped. I was crying, bawling at times, and grieving in the way I imagine I was expected to, in conformity with generally accepted principles of grief. But also, don't get judgmental. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in this. I wasn't just feeling grief, but congratulating myself for it. I was seeing myself as the star of my loss, its protagonist, treading the boards, pacing under the proscenium arch of bereavement. Some part of me was saying, finally, reality, I've heard so much about it. That wasn't the real strangeness, though. It was this sin of self-awareness, this dramatization of the self, this consequentiality of consciousness, this aestheticization, this, the most pathetic of all the assertions of the self as it stumbles across its blasted heath of existence, was leading to a separation of self from self that was making apparent another person underneath. Another person suddenly arrived inside me. Another person as real as the person typing this, but detached, outside the world itself, and growing huge in relation to it. Another person was standing at the crossroads of time and space, shirtless, shoeless, but dressed in a nice suit, on the outside looking in, curious but indifferent to being and non-being, both of which he understood as accidental and impossible. The free person, the truly free, free from time, space, the world. Don't roll your eyes. This was actually happening. Cool and supercilious before a million universes, Whitman says, or something like that. In the years when you were angry with me and frightened for me, the search for this person haunted my mind. But now that I was he was the last person I wanted to be. The distance I suddenly had achieved wasn't joyous. It was unendurable. This was why I kept talking and talking whenever I could, climbing hand over hand up the rope of words to get back to my ordinary, unenlightened self. I was clinging to other people with words. I was gripping them by their lapels. I couldn't let them go. The knowledge I had, I didn't want. I knew, though, probably for the first time in my life, what I did want. I wanted the details. I wanted to be sitting on the living room couch, watching Jeopardy with you. Yeah. Thank you.
I love the Jeopardy bit. It's so... I used to do that with Jeopardy.
Yeah.
You're quizzing Indians and quizzing?
Sure.
Do you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Indians love Jeopardy. Yeah. Indians in America, they all watch Jeopardy. When they're not, watching spelling bees.
The dramatization of the self. That really, really struck me in this.
Yeah. Well, you should have noticed, Arshia, at the end, right? Because you are a student of the ancient texts, that the speaker of the poem becomes liberated. moksha, right? And
He wants to go back to the
discovers the eternal self. And then, he doesn't want anything to do with the eternal self. He wants to go back to, just being with his dad. And, transcendence is not all it's cracked up to be. Yeah. And it will happen anyway. So, let's live our life in this life as long as we possibly can.
Anyway, so we are just about out of time. So why don't you read for us To the Reader?
Okay.
Because it's a lovely poem and it's very, very... So I'm not going to say anything after that. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Vijay Sheshadri, for being here and sharing this absolutely marvelous conversation.
Oh, yeah. And thank you for, stepping in for Jeet.
My pleasure.
The last moment, and for your incredible natural diligence. It's just fantastic. Anyway, this poem is the last poem in the book. It's called To the Reader. And, and it kind of approaches this theme of the self that, and you can substitute to the listener, but I'm not going to change the poem. To the Reader. I'm writing this so I can tell you that what you're thinking about me is exactly what I'm thinking about you. What you're reading is exactly what you're writing by the light of a taper deep inside yourself at your walnut secretary. These words are saying what those words say, and these and those are those and these, mine and yours, and have no meaning, only form. Talk about being one with others. We correspond one to one. And there is a grandeur in this. You'll understand that someday. Just now, though, you're stupefied at this spooky action at a distance. So would I be, and I am.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.